Well, good morning, class. Happy Friday. Welcome back to Life of Christ, rather. Sorry, it's one of those days. Welcome back to Life of Christ. And this day, again, this Friday, September 18th, we are going to spend our time together thinking through, as it is outlined in your syllabus, we're going to be thinking about the silent years. And so that's a phrase that basically refers to sort of this period of time following the birth of Christ to his baptism, sort of to his public ministry. Mark's gospel, John's gospel, they're virtually silent, and that would be the same with Matthew's gospel. We have a little hint here and there in Luke's gospel of Jesus at a time when he was a young boy visiting the temple with his family, which he would have done on a yearly basis, sort of hanging out and arguing with the scribes and the lawyers there about rabbinic law and things of that nature. But that's just one detail that we have, and it's really the only detail that we have of these silent years. And so what we're going to do then is we're going to spend our time, get this going for you here, we're going to spend our time reflecting upon these silent years and really try to zero in on three sort of topics with our class. We want to talk about Jesus's siblings, Jesus's skill, and Jesus's speech. And so I think most of this will be review, assuming that you're doing the readings that you're supposed to be doing. And so this class should be relatively short and just be kind of review and reiteration. Let's start with Jesus's siblings. If you look at Mark 3, beginning in verse 31, we read of this incident. Mark 3:31, and his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you." And he answered them, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother." And so here you have an identification of Jesus's family. He has a mother and he has siblings, brothers and sisters. It's argued that by this time, the reason that we don't hear of Joseph is that his father has died. That's probably why in the gospel records, outside of the birth narratives, we really have no mention at all of Joseph or at all. That's probably why. If you fast forward to Mark 6 and you look at verse 1, we read, "He went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, 'Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands?'" In verse 3, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joses and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And the text continues. And so again, another overt, blatant reference to the fact that Jesus has brothers and sisters. And so the question is, well, what are we to make of these siblings? And I'm going to be completely honest. I think that if it wasn't for some sort of peculiar and idiosyncratic Roman Catholic dogma, this really is a non-issue. The text is actually remarkably clear in this regard, but because Roman Catholicism is as popular as it is, at least here in the West, we need to be aware that this is one of the issues. It's not a big issue that divides Protestants and Roman Catholics, but it does divide us. And one of the reasons is not so much this doctrine, but how this doctrine is sort of like links in a chain connected to other Roman Catholic dogma. So let's just talk real briefly and review some of what we've been learning. What are the three views, that main interpretations that, in terms of how we account for Jesus's siblings? The first is that these children are the result of a previous marriage. So the theory, and that's all that it is, it's a theory. We have no biblical, textual, historical support for this. It's just, we have to find a way to fill the void, or Yeah, let's put it that way. And so the theory is that Joseph was married before Mary. He had a bunch of kids with that wife. Something happened to that wife. She died. Now Joseph what's a male widower, I think. One of you can correct me. Joseph was a widowee, ended up marrying Mary later in life and sort of brought into this marriage a bunch of children. The second view is that these were not actually siblings of the Lord Jesus, but that they were cousins. And then a third view is that exactly that. They were siblings, that they were Jesus's younger brothers and sisters. They were born to Joseph and Mary after Jesus's birth. Okay, so those are the three main views. As we're thinking through and trying to make sense of this, in terms of saying that these are Joseph's children from a previous marriage, the text seems to suggest that these are Mary's children. So if you look back at Mark 6:3 again, we are told, is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joses and Judas and Simon? In other words, the argument seems to be going not on Joseph, but on Mary. If you go the other way to Matthew 12, and I believe it's verse 46. Again, while he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside, asking to speak with him. But he replied to the man who told them, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And same as the parallel story. The point is, the text seems to lend itself to the fact that these are actually Mary's children and not Joseph's from a previous marriage. Also, it's worth pointing out that when it comes to Joseph and Mary, and this is a Roman Catholic dogma, sort of the perpetual virginity of Mary. If you're in Matthew's Gospel, if you're still there, if you look at chapter 1 of Matthew's Gospel, beginning in verse 24. So this is when the angel has just appeared to Joseph and told him of Mary being with child and not to leave her. We're told in verse 24, when Joseph woke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his wife, that is, took Mary to be his wife. Verse 25, but knew her not until she had given birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. It seems, again, more than apparent that it's not as if Mary never had sexual intercourse. That until word in verse 25, it says that Joseph took his wife and knew her not. That's a euphemism. It means have intercourse with her. It doesn't mean know her like he knows how much she weighs or her height or her hair color. It's not that sort of no. It's not an academic no. It's an intimate no. Again, it has the connotation of sexual intercourse. So he knew her not until she had given birth to Jesus. And so the implication in the text is that Joseph and Mary procreated just like any husband and wife would. They had a family and they began having children, pardon my language, normally after the birth of Jesus. And so I think I don't want to be sort of snarky or pugnacious, but I think the simple, plain, honest reading of the text would lead us to believe that Jesus's siblings are, in fact, Jesus's siblings, which also means that when we're talking about these silent years of the Lord Jesus, we have to keep in mind that other than Jesus being sinless, he was a human being in the same way that you and I are human beings. It means he had brothers and sisters and he played with them and roughhoused with them and did things that 5-year-old boys do and did things that 15-year-old boys do, right? Jesus had brothers, Jesus had sisters. He had a normal life in that sense. Let's shift gears very quickly to Jesus's skill. So after Jesus was not after, but as Jesus was sort of growing up, what sort of occupation did he have? What vocation was he called to? What did Jesus do in terms of his 8 to 5? Well, Matthew 13:55 is more than clear. Joseph was a carpenter, which means that in that day and age, sons generally followed in the footsteps of their fathers, which means that Jesus too would have been a carpenter. And again, we saw that language in Matthew 13:55. We read it just in Mark 6:3 a moment ago. So when we think of Jesus' skill, we ought to think of him as a carpenter. But at the same time, sort of like the Christmas narrative, where we think of like these three wise men or something like that, we ought not to like kind of let cultural perceptions dictate our views of Jesus. When the Bible speaks of Joseph being a carpenter and the implication being that Jesus followed in his footsteps, we ought not to think of Jesus like with this little shop in the backyard where he makes sort of like these janky spice racks or something like that. The Greek word that is used for carpenter actually paints us a different picture. So I've given you one of the entries from Lowe and Nida. This is a Greek lexicon for the word that is used to describe Jesus's occupation. It's the word tectone. This is the entry. There is every reason to believe that in biblical times, one who was regarded as a tectone, that is a carpenter, would be skilled in the use of wood and stone and possibly even metal. Which means that when we read of Jesus being a carpenter, that's probably true insofar as it goes, but it would have been more than simply woodworking. Jesus probably would have also been something of a stone mason. He was good with his hands. He was a typical sort of blue-collar laborer in that day and age. And again, he would have done more than build cheap little birdhouses and janky little spice racks or something like that. He no doubt would have been probably in the business of building buildings or sort of bridges or roadways or structures of that nature. I hate to stereotype, but Jesus was a man's man, right? He would bring his lunchbox to work. He would sweat real hard. He'd stink really bad when he came home. That's the sort of picture that we have from Jesus. It also means, just sort of as an aside, that Jesus would have come from anywhere from a poor to middle class home by today's standards. Jesus, given his occupation, given Palestine, given the first century, given what we know of tectones or carpenters, Jesus wouldn't have lived in a big house on the hill, but Jesus also wouldn't have been, in poverty or something of that nature. Again, to use today's sort of anachronistic standards, he would have been anywhere between sort of poor and middle class. Let's shift gears, and then with this we'll be done. Let's talk about Jesus's speech very quickly. This is helpful. It's important to keep in mind. This is the language really of the first century in Palestine. You had Greek, you had Aramaic, you had Hebrew, and you had Latin. You'll remember from your readings that Greek was essentially the common language in this day and age because, part of what Alexander the Great did a couple hundred years before the time of Jesus is what we say is he Hellenized the area. And you remember that was part of Alexander the Great's sort of kind of conquest and triumphing over different lands, is that he loved Greek language, he loved the Greek culture, he loved the Greek way of life. And so one of the things that he did was introduce all of those things into the places that he went, which means that by the time you get to the first century in Israel, Greek would have been the common trade language. It would have been what was spoken in sort of business dealings. Again, it's always anachronistic and it's difficult to draw parallels, but in much of the world today, at least civilized world, the business world, English is a language that is spoken. And so we might think of kind of modern day English, how it spans both East and West, and sort of commercially and economically, we might think of Greek in that way in the ancient world. So Jesus would have been more than acquainted and fluent in the Greek language. There's also the Aramaic language. This was, again, in the first century, the main familial language of the Jews. And what I mean by that is that if Jesus wasn't selling these spice racks that he had built, if Jesus was at home, or if Jesus was, with his family, and in the bulk of Jesus's teaching we find in the New Testament, this would all have been done in the Aramaic tongue. And you can see in Mark's gospel, some of that Aramaic is retained and translated for us by Mark, from Aramaic into Greek, and then we get it obviously in English. And so what's one of the phrases? Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Or another one of the phrases, Eli Kumi. I'm stalling now. When he tells the daughter to rise and eat. I have a Bible with me that's not a red letter Bible, which means it all looks black, which means I'm going to have a really tough time finding it just sort of off the cuff. I'll have to leave that to one of you in the discussions. You know what? I'm going to make that part of your homework. I'm going to make that your discussions. Go through Mark's gospel and find the Aramaic teaching, the stuff that Mark retains in the Aramaic tongue. So yeah, we'll make that your homework. There's also the Hebrew language. This was the traditional language of the Jews. This is what the Old Testament is written in. It's written in the Hebrew tongue. You remember, though, again, because of Alexander the Great and the 3rd and 4th century BC, and sort of the Hellenization of this part of the world. By the time you get to Jesus, the Hebrew tongue is one that is really only used in religious contexts. Again, it's anachronistic, but you might think of, I assume we all know all sorts of immigrants from Mexico, for example, and you'll have first generation immigrants who obviously speak Spanish, and they have kids, and then their kids have kids, and really they know very little Spanish. They've grown up in the United States. They've grown up, particularly here, maybe in the Pacific Northwest. They've grown up in public schools where English is sort of the common language. And so if any of their Spanish is retained at all, it might be just sort of used with mom and dad or grandma and grandpa. They know enough to get by, so to speak. That might be sort of a parallel with Hebrew. By the time you get to the 1st century, Hebrew is not widely used in public. It's not used in the marketplace. It's not used in commerce. It's used in religious contexts. It would be used in the temple. It would be used in the synagogue and those types of things. But again, you have to understand that these sort of things are kind of compartmentalized. You've got Greek if you want to do business. You've got maybe sort of Aramaic at home, and you've got Hebrew in the temple. And these things, they're not hermetically sealed by any stretch of the imagination, but there is a time and place in which you would speak this language for this purpose, or something to that effect. Finally, very quickly, there would be Latin. Now, I don't know, I get the impression in my studies that Jesus probably didn't speak Latin. But it is worth pointing out that, again, in the 1st century, in the Roman Empire, Latin was the official language. But again, by Jesus's day and age, it probably only would have been used by Roman officials. So again, we don't have any record of Jesus speaking Latin, and we don't really see any reason why he would have. So anyway, I hope this has been helpful as we're sort of reflecting on these silent years, this, really a 30-year period in which the life of our Lord is not recorded for us in the Gospels, we can sort of fill in some of those gray areas by noting, again, Jesus's siblings, the brothers and sisters that he would have grown up with. We can note Jesus's skill, again, how he would have, for lack of better words, kind of paid the bills, and his vocation. And then, of course, the language that he would have used throughout the course of his life. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you enjoy your weekend. I hope the Lord's Day is restful and refreshing for you. And I'll see you guys on Monday. God bless.